When examining literature, there are often a few different common terms that are used. Here we'll talk about and focus on 5 of them, but those pieces really are transitioning. I'm trying to get you to transition into the next step beyond this class, and that's going to be English 1301. So in English 1301, students are going to be required to complete different types of essays. And with those different types of essays, students are usually required to read different types of literature. And please be advised, literature is not like Catching Fire that you're reading right now. Literature is going to be looking at renowned authors that are from colonial times, American literature, looking at British literature, looking at just different worldwide literature. And really, honestly, most English 1301 instructors, they use short stories because short stories are very intense and focused and are able to be picked apart using different common literature terms. So when you have to look at different types of literature, specifically short stories, you really have to be able to investigate important terms to analyze this information, because as we learned last week when we talked about making inferences, you have to be able to look beneath the words itself, look for a deeper meaning for the information, and be able to make assumptions and suggestions based on evidence inside of those stories and evidence inside of information that the writer is giving to the reader. So I really put this picture here many years ago. I heard a really famous term, and I really love it, that many times students are often only going snorkel deep for information. And really what that means is students often just graze the surface of information, especially for stories, primarily because we read the words and we look at the literal meaning of words. And instead of digging deep and looking beyond those pieces, we just stay at the surface. So, the snorkeler here in the picture, that's really where a lot of students are. And unfortunately, a lot of students stay there. They don't dig deeper for information. Really, the person that is scuba diving, that's where you should be when you're examining information. You have to dig deep. You have to go down deep for the information, and you have to find different types of meaning. The good part about finding different types of meaning is that everybody has different experiences and diverse connections with literature. So the common terms that we're going to look at can sometimes be interpreted different ways for the different types of literature that you look at and the short stories that you'll examine. So it gives a lot of room for interpretation, but remember, like last week, any interpretation that you connect with these literature terms has to be supported with evidence. And that evidence comes from the short story. So you're really not looking outside of the short story for research or these other things. You are focusing all of these literature terms that we'll talk about. You're focusing all of those pieces specifically on that short story. Where can I find this piece in the story? Where can I find this? Where can I find this? So let's look further. So one of the common literary terms, and I'm sure you've probably seen this before, is the term theme. A theme is the message the writer is using to convey the overall story, the overall information. Usually a reader has to know, who is the main character or characters? Is there a conflict between those characters? Is that conflict, is it resolved? Is it fixed? And sometimes it's not always fixed in a good way. Remember, in life we can have problems, and not always are our problems or conflict solved in a nice way. And then you have to take all that information and you have to think about it. Well, what's the meaning of this conflict? Is it talking about that we need to have open communication? Is it talking about, a lack of communication? Is it talking about death? Is it talking about wanting to hurt someone? What is the overall message? And so that is theme. And really, students, over the course of their prior educational experience, I'm pretty sure that most students have seen this word theme before. So this should not be an uncommon literary term or a literature term. A second common literary term is going to be tone and diction. Tone is the attitudes used toward the subjects and toward the audience sometimes in the literary work. So really you're going to look at the tone in regard to, is it a very casual way of writing inside of the short story? Is it very formal and very proper? Sometimes the conversations between characters or the narrator and the reader, it can be very intimate, almost in a very loving term. It can be solemn. A solemn is very, very quiet, and sometimes, I don't want to say always negative, but sad and somber, or it could be playful. The writer could be having a very playful short story and something playful going on between the characters. So the tone at times is giving the reader kind of the feelings and the attitudes of what's really going on between those characters. The theme is, how the theme is approached inside of that short story is really what we're able to see with the tone. Diction is very similar. Oftentimes when I tell students, when you're looking at common literary terms, I really pull tone and diction together, because tone is what are the words that the writer is using to express feelings and emotion inside of the writing. Whereas diction are the actual words. What are the words that they're using to express? Are they saying, oh, the writer's happy and giddy and very playful? Or are they talking about death and possibly, a psychotic person and expressing different types of words? It could be a dialect, the way that they're speaking. Maybe they're from different dialects. So someone from Texas speaks in one dialect, as well as someone from a different part of the United States could speak differently. So maybe there's a conflict in regard to the dialect. So the diction are the actual words that are being used. It's not necessarily the emotion, but they're connected because the words in that diction are helping to express the attitudes towards the characters and the attitudes that are given in the theme towards the reader, because the reader is the one that is having to evaluate this. And these writers, they use every word very purposefully because it is a short story. It's not like Catching Fire, the book that we're reading now. It's not like that because, Suzanne Collins, who's the author of Catching Fire, she has a whole book to be able to be expressive and show emotion and give description. However, short story writers, which you evaluate in English 1301, they have a very brief context to be able to express exactly what's happened, how it's resolved, and move forward from there. A third literary term is symbolism, and many students are they shy away from the word symbolism when really we see symbolism all around us all the time. Symbolism, it is the representation of an object or even a person in some symbolic form, which means it means more than what it really is. So I'm actually going to push this hyperlink and we're going to go into a quiz. And I'm sure once we start seeing a few of these objects and start answering a few of these quiz questions, you'll say, okay, I get a better understanding of what a quiz is. So let's click into this hyperlink. All right. So question number 1. Let's start. So is this a symbol? So this picture right here, is this a symbol of Ohio, the United States, Germany, or a school? I'm sure we would all say the United States. Here we have a picture of, to me, what it looks like is the Titanic. And it says, is this a symbol of great human accomplishment, great human arrogance, great human tragedy, or all of the above? I'm going to say all of the above. The reason why it is all of the above is the Titanic was a great human accomplishment for the time that it was built. Further, it was great human arrogance. We all know what happened with the Titanic. People are like, oh, it was the unsinkable ship, and on its maiden voyage, on its initial voyage from Europe to the United States, it sank. And then last, it was great human tragedy because in the entirety of its sinking, so many people, I believe over 1,500 people, lost their lives. And so all of that in itself, even though it's a picture of a ship, it's a picture of a Titanic. So this object is a symbol of more than what it seems. Here we have a picture of what it looks like a dove. So what is this a symbol of? When we think of a dove, what do we think of? Anger, comedy, peace, or tragedy? And here we'll say peace. Because most people, when they think of a dove, they think of it being associated or symbolizing peace. Is this a symbol of time waits for no man, a common experience, a mystery, or a clock? So let's look at what the image is. It looks like it says Father Time, and it has an old gentleman holding a clock. And this looks very creepy. This is, I always think of the Grim Reaper holding this. So if you had to assume, based off of the evidence here, what would you assume that this image symbolizes? That time waits for no man. And so I could continue to go forward, but I think students really at this point are getting a good idea. It is an object or a person that symbolizes and has greater meaning than merely what it is. And so everything that is done in a short story, there are often times, and honestly most of the time, I say 90% of the time, there are objects that the characters inside of the story that they engage with and they go back and forth with. And so with that being said, you have to be able to look at the way that characters in a short story engage with different objects. You know, inside of a story, if something is talked about or something is thrown or something is done in some kind of strange way, you have to look at that object and say, well, why did the character do this? What does that symbolize to the character? Not to you, but to the character. How does all of these things engage with one another? And the final literary term that we're going to look at is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is a literary technique in which the writer explains certain plot events in the writing that may happen later. So when you're at the outset of a short story and you see some words or you see actions that are going on with the character, these things are oftentimes foreshadowing or foretelling what will happen later. We may not know because as a reader, we haven't gotten that far yet. But if someone says at the beginning of a story, I vow revenge against this person, well, what do you think is going to happen later? Why would a character say, I'm going to vow revenge on someone, and then nothing ever happens? So you might foresee or foreshadow. The author is telling us something bad's going to happen. So these details, they mentally prepare the reader for how the story is going to unfold. So all of these literary terms, the theme, tone, diction, symbolism, and foreshadowing, these are common terms you will see again in English 1301, 1302, and I'm even more confident into an American literature or British literature. So this is not something that is going to go away. You need to become familiar with these pieces because they will rear their ugly head again and you will see them again beyond my class. I just want to give you a taste of these pieces and even in a writing excerpt so that you have a familiarity with it. So we're going to practice discussing and evaluating these literary terms in a short story. So similar to last week, students read the Cask of Amontillado. And the author was Edgar Allan Poe. But before we get into a different short story by Edgar Allan Poe, I want you to click the link inside of your Blackboard lesson and look at a short biography of Edgar Allan Poe. Knowing the author really kind of sometimes gives the reader some idea. If you know the personality of a person, or at least mystery that surrounds someone, or even controversy, sometimes that gives a bit of a hint of the way that that person writes and what we should be prepared for. So we're going to stop here for a moment, go into your Blackboard lesson, click on the link that will give you the short biography of Edgar Allan Poe. I believe it's about 3 minutes. So take a moment to take care of that. Now that you've returned, we're going to read a story, A Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. So now you have some background information of Edgar Allan Poe. You've already read another one of his works, The Cask of Amontillado, that you read last week. You annotated, answered questions, inferred some information about The Cask of Amontillado. You've read one of his works, and I hope you can see the connection of the mystery and dark cloud and kind of the peculiarity that you read initially in the story, and now what you see from the author, you can kind of see that they match a bit. So here's another story, and I've actually given you a Blackboard link, a hyperlink inside of your lesson, so that the story can be read to you. Some students like to be read to, and I like to be read to because some people act it out and I find it amusing. So inside of your Blackboard lesson is a link that will be read to you. I also included a Microsoft Word to where the story is inside of that Microsoft Word document, and students can get in there, read along as the YouTube video is actually reading the story to you, and so that you're actually being able to learn and engage with the story in 2 different ways, by reading it and following along, as well as auditorily that someone else is reading it to you. So we'll stop here, pull up the Microsoft Word document, follow along. You do not need to annotate that story. This is merely for an example, but follow along so that you will have read this. And we'll stop here and do that. And so the last part of A Telltale Heart is, so far you've evaluated Edgar Allan Poe through a short biography. You have actually read A Telltale Heart thus far, so you had it read to you, or you read it on your own. Thus, you had it side by side, so you were able to engage in the story. And it is a bit shorter than The Cask of Amontillado, so I do like that. And most students, I'm sure, do like that. The last part, and I always tell students this, especially if you're reading a short story, if you can find a reenactment or a play that tells, that story, I strongly suggest that students do that, because sometimes being able to see the play reenacted, or at least visually, students are able to get a greater understanding of the theme, the tone, and the diction, because the words are coming from that short story. They're able to see symbolism in the objects that are oftentimes carried and backed up by evidence in the short story. And last, they're able to foreshadow. So sometimes being able to see those pieces through a kinesthetic learning style of watching a video and engaging with it with what you've already read will help. So again, go on your Blackboard lesson, click on the link that shows the video, and then we'll talk here in just a moment. So let's do that. So at this point, we have thoroughly evaluated the short story, A Telltale Heart. You've read it, or you've had it read to you. You've watched a short story of it, or excuse me, a short video of it. And at this point, you should have some information in your head as far as, what is going on with the story, what really is going on. So now let's start using our common literary terms, our literature terms. Let's start picking apart the story. It's not necessarily anymore that we just watched it and, we just read it and here we took notes of it. Let's pick it apart based off of these terms. So here is actually a common outline for writing an essay in which we pick apart a short story based on these terms. So in the introduction paragraph, you should have notes of this or pull up the PowerPoint that I gave you in your Blackboard lesson. But in your introduction paragraph, I always tell students, you need to have the theme. So as you read A Telltale Heart, and then you watched the video, you should have seen that a theme was that the narrator, because I don't believe we ever get his names, it's just the narrator. It's the guy telling the story to the reader. The narrator believes that he's a very clever man that's going to get rid himself of this evil eye that haunts him. And so I would probably give a bit more description, but really in a nutshell, that's what the theme is about. It's about, you might even call the narrator crazy man, because honestly as the reader, I'm like, this guy's insane. All right, he thinks that an eye is evil. But he doesn't think that he's crazy. If you go back and you're able to read any of that information, he truly thinks he's a very smart man, and he says, you may think of me a madman, but I'm not. I'm thinking very clearly. And as you see as the story plays out, that's not completely true. All right. So in your introduction paragraph, you have 1 to 2 sentences that give the theme, because you have to assume that your reader of your essay has never read this story before. So you are the only person through your writing that is giving a very brief and descriptive idea of what happened in the story. And remember, then from that point inside of your introduction paragraph, you have a thesis statement. Your thesis statement is the most important sentence of your entire essay. This one sentence tells the reader what is the entire idea. What's the main point of this whole essay? Well, you have to remember, why are you writing this essay? You're writing this essay to describe those common literary terms. It's not to describe the story. Yes, you are using the story, but you're using the story as evidence. You're using the story as evidence that these terms exist in that short story. So your thesis has to have some statement, or the way that you create that thesis statement has to say, in the story by Edgar Allan Poe, several common literary terms are used and evidenced in the essay. The way that you phrase it, you have to, that's your whole focus, because the 3 body paragraphs that follow this are talking about tone and diction, talking about symbolism, and talking about foreshadowing. You have to be descriptive for your reader. Tell them what they're looking at. Tell them what they're reading. Okay? So remember, that's one sentence inside of your introduction paragraph. So again, your introduction paragraph is the first paragraph that you write. You have the theme of the story, and then you further have a thesis statement. Your thesis statement, it's the central point of your entire essay. Why is your reader reading this? Well, they're going to read it because they're going to find that common literary terms, they're evidenced in your story. All right, so your body paragraph number 1. This is a strong suggestion. You don't have to follow what I'm saying. But since we're describing common literary terms, and this is just an example, we're going to look at tone and diction. Now remember, tone is the emotion or attitudes and feelings that is expressed by the writer, seen through the characters. All right, so you're describing that. Who are your characters? How are they feeling? What are they expressing? And the diction are the words that they use. How are the words that they are using backing up that tone that's used and seen throughout that short story? So you have your topic sentence. Your topic sentence should basically tell the reader, possibly tell them that you're talking about tone and diction in this entire paragraph. Body paragraph number 2 should focus on symbolism. You have your topic sentence, your numerous details, and your conclusion sentence. So what elements inside, if you were looking at, obviously, A Telltale Heart, what the evil eye? The evil eye is the old man's eye. So what does that symbolize? You should say that it symbolizes evil. Well, who does it symbolize evil to? Well, the narrator. All right? And at the very end, of the short story, there is a beating. There's a beating of a heart. And so what does that symbol? Whose heart is that? That the narrator believes that he hears. What does it symbolize? Truly, honestly, it symbolizes his conscience. The crazy man's or the narrator's conscience. Because even though he thought he ridded himself of this evil, that evil, does it really exist outside of the narrator? You should say no. The evil actually exists inside of the narrator. Because who's really evil? The narrator is, even though he denies it over and over and over again. And then when the narrator, at one point, he spends several days, he says, at night I go in and I open the door a crack. At night I open the door a crack. He keeps going in night after night after night and peeking in. And then one night, I assume that he went in and woke the old man, and the old man opened, and so the evil eye was present. And then the narrator's lantern shone upon the evil eye. So when we think of light, what do we think of? What does light symbolize? Many might say that the light symbolizes goodness or purity. And what does the narrator believe that the evil eye stands for? It stands for bad. It symbolizes evil. So when you have good shining upon evil, the narrator used that symbolic nature for his purity shining upon the evil eye to act, to go ahead and attack. He could not stand it any longer, so he attacked the old man. And the last body paragraph, foreshadowing. What pieces or what wording in the beginning of that short story, A Telltale Heart, what was foreshadowing what was going to play out at the end? What elements, or what words did he use? What was the narrator saying or talking about that was foreshadowing bad things to come? And then the very last paragraph is your conclusion. This is where you're doing an overall summary of your literary terms from A Telltale Heart. So remember, all of your evidence is not coming from external sources. You're not going to the website. You're not going to websites to be able to, pull in data or information. This is not my opinion. This is not your opinion. This is basically evidence that is supported. We talked last week about inferences. If you cannot support it, how are you making an accurate interpretation? How are you able to make an inference or make an assumption or educated guess about these literary terms without evidence? You have to have evidence. And so here we are, and this week students are actually going to write a 5-paragraph, 750-word essay based on the story they read last week. So it's the same author. We're looking at Edgar Allan Poe, but I used A Telltale Heart story as an example of a short story by the same author, picking apart literary terms that you can find inside of a short story. So you're not going to use that. You're going to take your story that you read last week for the CASK of Amontillo. All right, I gave you a video inside of last week's lesson. You annotated the article already, so you should have a broader understanding of what's going on with that. You are welcome. Students are always welcome to go to different websites to gain a deeper understanding in case that they don't understand. That does not give you authorization to plagiarize or pull information from their website. It does give you a stronger capability to make sure that you do understand what's going on with the story. So using the CASK of Amontillo, students are going to look at theme, tone and diction, symbolism, and foreshadowing. So remember, the concept and literary term of theme, it is found in your introduction paragraph, along with your thesis statement. Your Body 1 paragraph should be tone and diction. Your Body 2 paragraph should be about symbolism. What symbolic people or objects or clothing, what pieces are found inside of the CASK of Amontillo, and how can you evidence that? How are you interpreting these symbolic pieces from your story? And the last body paragraph is foreshadowing. What information? And I'll give you a little bit of a hint. The first sentence of the Cask of Amontillado, it says, "I vow revenge." Is that not foreshadowing the entire outline of the rest of the story? Okay, and so there are other pieces inside that show foreshadowing, the literary concept or the literary term of foreshadowing. So you're welcome to use the hint I gave you, but give me another. Be descriptive. If you're having to write 750 words, those body paragraphs are going to be descriptive. They're going to elaborate. All right. You have to use MLA format, and I will put a web link inside of the Blackboard lesson so that you can reference that to make sure you are using MLA format. It has specific heading, it has to have a title, as well as your double spacing, indented paragraph, and so forth. Do keep in mind that this is written in third person. And what I mean by that is you are not allowed to use I, you're not allowed to use me, my, you, or your. You cannot use any of those pronouns because that is first and second person. I think my students are intelligent people, but I don't want to see I this. Here is my essay. That is not appropriate for this type of essay. It would not be appropriate for your English 1301 essay. It's third person. He, she, it, they, the narrator, the author, the old man. For the Cask of Amontillado, use the narrator, Montracer, Fortunato. Use the characters' names to be descriptive. And don't get lost in the pronoun he, because in the Cask of Amontillado, how many he's are there? There's 2. So if you use the pronoun he, do I know which he you're talking about? You need to evaluate your essay to make sure that you have fixed grammatical issues. That's going to be a big piece. You have to move away from fragments. You have to move away from making run-on sentences and making grammatical errors. If you do not practice to remove yourself from these pieces, you're going to continue them in English 1301, and they will be harsher on you than I am going to be. So you've got to make a move and push away from those pieces. If you have any questions in regard to this essay, I'm always available online. But my request is that if I help and give you assistance, that you have to evidence to me that you've already gone through this and that there's further difficulty.